It is said that education is the great equalizer. If this is true, then Thurgood Marshall is one of the greatest contributors to African Americans achieving equality in America. Thurgood Marshall took a stand against segregation in schools through his work in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Because of his outstanding efforts to make a historic change in civil rights, he set a precedent for the equality enjoyed by many Americans today. Thurgood Marshall believed that segregation in schooling would stop blacks from having a fair chance in life. As a child, Thurgood was not allowed to play with white children or go to school with them because of his race. Facing segregation in his childhood made Thurgood Marshall aware that unequal education was the cause of blacks not having a fair chance. He knew that black and white children possessed equal learning potential and that segregated schools were deliberately designed to oppress black people. In one of his quotes, he said, "If children could play together and interact with each other, why are they not able to go to school together?" End quote. Fortunately for Thurgood, having his parents take him to the courthouse as a child fueled his urge to be a lawyer. Not only was Thurgood determined to end segregation, but he thought of a way to end it. Thurgood Marshall used many reasons to persuade judges to end segregation in schooling. In a few places, even before the United States Supreme Court decided Brown, it was actually ruled that blacks should be moved into white schools because of the drastic tangible differences in education and appearance. However, most school districts did not do this. Some just tried to fix up black schools. Marshall did not believe that this would achieve equality. Thurgood Marshall believed that it was important to study the effects of segregation itself on public education. In 1954, he argued to the Supreme Court in Brown that segregated schools were not equal and could never be made equal. He told them that laws can change, so they should make the decision based on the present and not the past. Thurgood Marshall was not lucky in winning the 29 out of 32 cases he argued before the Supreme Court. He was prepared. He possessed many attributes that helped him along the way. As his son said,
So he was incredibly thorough.
For example, he was well-versed and fully knowledgeable on the law. He was also well aware of things not pertaining to law that other lawyers might not have thought of, like focusing on the realities of segregation rather than making assumptions. He was also determined and persistent, but polite as to not come off as aggressive. In 1961, as a law student, Eleanor Applewhite worked with Mr. Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, a legal institution founded by Thurgood Marshall. It is in its 77th year and is still one of the most important legal organizations for the advancement of civil rights. She said,
"Thurgood could sit and joke with you, but he had a spine of steel."
Thurgood Marshall faced many challenges on his journey to be successful. He had to fight for civil rights while facing racial prejudice himself. He feared that because of his race, he would end up in jail like the people he was defending. He also feared that he would end up dead because he received many threats. Eleanor Applewhite said,
He had a great sense of humor and was a great storyteller and could keep you laughing. And what is particularly interesting is that he, and this was true for other lawyers in that office, they could keep you laughing about stories that sent shudders down your spine.
Thurgood Marshall tried to promote civil rights everywhere without using violence, although it was harder to do in the South. Thurgood's first wife died without seeing his success. Instead of taking this loss negatively, he used it so that he would not let another generation watch African Americans suffer in schools. Marshall worked with many people in order to succeed in reaching his goal of equality in civil rights. He worked with Attorney General Robert Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson, who both knew that it was important to the United States to advance civil rights. Marshall even indirectly worked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the Michael Schwerner case, a case that hits very close to my hometown of Pelham, where Schwerner grew up. Marshall not only worked with famous figures, but with students and everyday citizens. Many people believe that Brown was the most important case that Thurgood Marshall argued. His son said,
And I think that the conclusions that were reached in those cases are very meaningful in our society. But
Marshall said Brown was just a step toward advancing civil rights, and he wanted to improve all public civil rights, but started with schooling. According to the author of Thurgood Marshall's Supreme Court Justice, by the early 1930s, NAACP officials realized that blacks could never achieve social and economic equality without educational equality, and the organization made improved schooling for blacks a top priority. Brown was important because it would change the lives of students then and for further generations. Brown did not just influence students, but a whole country, and that was the effect Thurgood Marshall wanted. He argued for blacks to have the right to vote, to serve on juries, and to a fair trial, in order to make the United States fair for everyone. Because of his efforts in civil rights, Thurgood Marshall was given the nickname Mr. Civil Rights. Thurgood Marshall held many influential and high-ranking positions in the legal profession. In 1936, after practicing on his own, he was appointed Chief Legal Counsel of the NAACP. He founded and led the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund in 1940. Eleanor Applewhite said,
There were a total of 6 lawyers on the staff at the time.
Marshall was nominated for the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit by President Kennedy in 1961. In 1965, President Johnson appointed Marshall Solicitor General, and in 1967, President Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall to the United States Supreme Court. Marshall was the first African American ever appointed to that position and served for almost 24 years. Thurgood Marshall always thought of a way to make the world a better place, and he did so for generations of African American children to come. He won almost every single case, even though his childhood did not show a bright future. He turned his life around and made a huge difference in this world. He became known for his talent of studying cases and for arguing non-aggressively but with common sense. He had many firsts in his lifetime. He was the first black Solicitor General, the first black Supreme Court Justice, and he served with the United States Supreme Court for almost 24 years. He's remembered not merely because he was the first at many things, but because of his effort and time put into the cause of civil rights. His son said,
over the years, initially I thought, well, that's a little simplistic, and then I began to realize the beauty of that statement and his simplicity, and it's hard for me to improve on it, that he had these remarkable skills and talents, and he did everything he could with them. And one of the things that Brown's really liked about that statement is that he understates how skilled he was and how much he achieved, and I think his honesty when he said that.
Until the day he died, Thurgood Marshall never gave up his fight for racial equality or for the victims of injustice.